I remember my first playthrough of Elden Ring as an experience like no other. The second I opened those doors, let loose to explore its world, I knew that all of those years, all of that hype, and all of those E3s spent with my fingers crossed would be worth it. But I didn't know just how worth it until about 3 or 4 hours into the game. The first main boss was giving me a hard time, so I decided to poke around the rest of the map, discovering caves, castles, and a surprisingly galactic underground city. Though wherever I went, it always seemed to be in the opposite direction of my destination, the gigantic Erdtree, focal point of the game's narrative and lore. That was until I fought my way up to the top of a small archer's tower to claim a chest, but opening it didn't reveal a new weapon or item like usual, instead a much bigger reward. It transported me to a massive city, built at the base of the Erdtree, which turned out to be much bigger than I initially thought. I opened the map just to check, and the size of it doubled, dwarving what it was before. Straight away, I shared this moment with friends and other people online, who in turn were sharing their own discoveries as we all slowly began to learn just how massive Elden Ring truly was. It was hard to walk 10 feet without stumbling into an elaborate dungeon, a new boss, or sector of the map to get lost in. No square inch of Elden Ring's map was wasted. Everything was packed to the brim with secrets. Back before this game was combed clean by Souls experts and lore aficionados, everything was uncharted territory. You could be the next viral Twitter clip or Reddit thread just by taking a few extra seconds and voila, you were the first person to discover the best item in the game. Even nowadays, with every nook and cranny mined down to the literal code of the game, Elden Ring still feels like you're on a grand fantasy adventure. In fact, I would go as far as to say that Elden Ring is the first Souls game, Sekiro excluded, where you actually feel like the protagonist. In previous games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, you were more or less just finishing off remnants of a bleak world beyond repair, though Elden Ring's high fantasy setting gives the game a much more vibrant color palette, along with an ever-evolving landscape. You're different from other Tarnished in the lands between, being chosen by Melina, unknowingly helping Miquella, and marrying Ranni. Your progression in the game is noted, from things as small as new characters joining your home to meteors crashing down on Earth. You can either be the prophetic hero or villain of Elden Ring, as the lore allows you to come to your own conclusion. This is probably FromSoft's best writing up until this point. Not my favorite per se, but objectively the best. And I don't just mean world-building wise, as there is a massive push in character writing. No doubt thanks to the help of George R.R. Martin, author of A Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones. And from Soft past, characters in the lore felt like they came from epic Greek poems with barely any personality besides hubris. Though in Elden Ring, all of the bosses feel like real people. Their past, their beliefs, and their identity are all extremely distinct from one another, with their own litany of problems that can be traced back to the world that they live in. Elden Ring's lore is baked into every single tiny aspect of the game. Every single brick feels like it's placed deliberately to further the story. There is so much to interpret that is still an ongoing task to this day. All of these reasons of discovery, community, uncovering secrets, added on to the classic FromSoftware gameplay loop are what made my first 100-hour playthrough of Elden Ring my favorite video game experience of all time back in 2022. In fact, I had initially called it the greatest game ever made on my old YouTube channel, back when I was first starting out with little to no experience on this platform. I don't even think the video had a thumbnail, though to be honest, I kind of jumped the gun on that one. I was so swept off my feet that I failed to take a step back and actually look at Elden Ring, because all these years later, the thing that I loved the game for became my biggest criticisms upon replay. In past Soulsborne games, they would take you about 30 or so hours to beat on your first playthrough, though every subsequent is significantly shorter as you get better and better, knowing the best route, the best weapons, and the best strategy, all while avoiding your initial mistakes. Nowadays, if I want to play Dark Souls or Bloodborne, it'll take me 3 or 4 hours tops to beat, but of course that's after years of cracking these games wide open. The same can be said for Elden Ring, but not exactly. Again, my first playthrough lasted me nearly 100 hours, the second time about a year later, maybe only 20. This was mainly because I almost entirely ignored the open world aspect of the game. All of those dungeons, extra castles, optional bosses, and side adventures to be had, I just didn't feel like doing them because there wasn't really any reason to. I remember being so excited stumbling upon my first mausoleum in the game. It was tucked away in a hidden corner of Limgrave, just waiting to be explored. I had a blast fighting my way down to the bottom, concluding in a fateful battle with the boss. To be honest, I don't even remember what I got for beating it, because the feeling of accomplishment and adventure was more than enough. Now take this exact experience and repeat it about 200 times, give or take, across the entire game. Somehow, it didn't matter that they all had the same exact design, same loop, same enemies, and usually it was just the same boss, just buffed or duplicated. Sure, fighting a magma worm for the 5th time wasn't as exhilarating as fighting my first, but that reward of adventure was still there to make it all worthwhile. Though upon replay, when I go through that same dungeon I stumbled upon, almost all of the magic is gone, and instead I notice all the flaws. How repetitive the layout is, how generic the puzzles were, and how predictable the gimmicks are. Worst of all, I'm now fighting the same boss at the end of the tunnel for the 9th time, completely demolishing it, and all I get in return are some crappy spirit ashes or god-awful weapons I will never use. That sense of adventure and accomplishment is entirely gone as Elden Ring suddenly begins to crack. At first, I forced myself to redo more side content, frantically trying to recapture the feeling of my first playthrough, but it just won't work. I become more concerned about whether those item rewards will benefit my playstyle, but that's just not how Elden Ring or any Souls games actually work. As you know, these games aren't loot-based like Diablo or Destiny, where your reward at the end of the tunnel is a cool new set of gear. In the Soulsborne series, you pretty much have to pick one weapon and stick with it, as all your resources will be poured into improving said weapon. So it's hard to be excited when you get a strength talisman at the end of a repetitive boss fight if you're using a dex weapon. Eventually, I realized that the side content just wasn't worth it for me, and I decided to go straight for the main bosses. Though in doing that, something was different this time around, as they became much harder. Sure, I had the boss's movesets memorized, but I'm just dishing out almost no damage anymore while they 2-hit kill me. I was super confused as to why, but then I thought back to my first playthrough and how when a boss was giving me trouble, I would just leave, go out, explore, and do all of that side content. That's how you're supposed to play the game, and is why bosses like Margit, literally the first one, are so rough right out the gate. That side content doesn't just give you knowledge, it gives you runes to level up your stats. So when you come back, you're on even footing with the bosses, not making them a cakewalk, but much more manageable. Though without, you're practically just an underdeveloped punching bag, and with no drive to do any side content, you just kind of stay that way, making Elden Ring noticeably less fun. So I went for the next best option. During my first playthrough, I had accidentally discovered one of the most broken early game builds. It starts out like this. Use the sellswords from the warrior class, go to this fort on the outskirts of the giant forest, battle your way up to the top, fight this guy, and he will drop the Bloody Slash Ash of War. Despite receiving multiple nerfs, it's still one of, if not the best early game items, as on its own, it will demolish bosses in a few good hits. But what pushes it to the next level is the fact that you can duplicate Bloody Slash and put it on your left-hand weapon. This will help you build up bleed within a few hits, which takes a set 15% of an enemy's health bar. For the early game bosses, this will put you back on even footing with them, but the side bosses just kind of become even more of a joke. It's to the point where I feel kind of gross about killing them. I mean, I have the swords barely upgraded with no talismans and base armor. I don't really know how to describe it. It's almost as if I'm running around half naked, not utilizing 80% of the game's mechanics. It doesn't feel necessarily good when defeating a boss, even when I'm legitimately struggling. The perfectionist in me says I should be spending my time optimizing my current build, getting the right talismans, the right physic flasks, the better spells, and maybe even better weapons. But there's another voice that ultimately wins out. One that leads into another major flaw in my opinion, that being Elden Ring's build craft system. In a way, Elden Ring almost feels like a shonen anime, since we start off as bottom of the barrel bums, basic sword, basic attacks, no spells, maidenless, and what have you. But you slowly build your way up to the top with a vast array of skills that can crumble mountains. There are so many unique builds with their own special set of awesome abilities, to the point where it's genuinely overwhelming trying to decide which one to go with. So you boot up the game and watch a build tutorial on YouTube with all the items you'll be needing. For example, in this playthrough, I decided to finally give the famous Blasphemous Blade build a try. So all I needed to start was to beat Rykard, one of the final bosses of the game. Okay, this is going to take a while, so I guess I'll just stick with my shoddy sellswords. I mean, it'd just kind of be a waste of time going out my way to optimize them, since I'm just gonna ditch them, right? That was my mentality for about 80% of my 25-hour playthrough. because it wasn't until about 20 hours did I even get the Blasphemous Blade, the actual item I needed. By that point, almost all of the main bosses were already dead, especially the ones that I wanted to actually fight with my cool new weapon. All that was left were encounters I didn't really care for. In fact, almost every single cool build you see on Twitter takes ages to get started, with insanely high stat requirements, late game NPC quests, and super specific use cases. Sure, you could spend literal hours just farming runes to get everything, but where's the fun in that? The worst part is that once I got the Blasphemous Blade build complete, it just wasn't any fun to use in my opinion. I guess I could have respect to a build I did previously, but I've already dedicated so much time and effort, I might as well see it through. Plus, you only get so many larval tiers in the game anyways, which dedicating a whole run to something isn't just a one and done choice, especially for someone like me. Now I'm just stuck with a playstyle that I regret committing to. But by this point in the playthrough, I started to notice a trend, as my enjoyment of Elden Ring always invariably starts to tank, and frankly, I kind of get sick of it. This seems to always occur when I fight the Fire Giant, what I consider the first skill check boss of the game. Up until this point, all of the bosses are on pretty much the same difficulty level. That's because you only really need to defeat 2 of the demigods in order to move on to the end game. But in reality, you'll want to fight all of them because you'll be missing out on some of the best parts of Elden Ring. So that's what everyone does, usually in different orders and under different circumstances, but we all end up funneled towards the same exact point. That of course being at the foot of the Erdtree, facing Morgott. One of my favorite moments in the entire game, but unfortunately a pretty easy one. I've never died to him once, as he's widely considered one of the easiest bosses. I think that this is due to FromSoft not balancing Morgott for you to have killed as many demigods as you have, so pretty much everybody is severely overleveled going in. From here on, the game takes you down a much more linear path than before to reach the Fire Giant. At one point in development, I imagined the Fire Giant was a regular boss who was regularly balanced. He still might have been hard, but not so hard to the point where there is an ocean's length between him and the bosses before. He has far too much health, deals far too much damage, and just doesn't ever seem to die. This fight is so unbelievably tedious. It's as if I'm just slowly punching a concrete wall for hours on end, but if I slip up once, I have to start all over. It doesn't feel like he was designed around these sorts of numbers, but more so, someone at FromSoft just jacked up his stats at the 11th hour, mainly for 3 reasons. The first being that they didn't want him to meet the same fate as Morgott and get pancaked by other players. The second is that he is also meant to serve as a Margit-like figure, and that you're once again supposed to go out, explore, come back when you're ready. But it doesn't really work this time, since I've now explored the entire map twice over, and the new areas I've unlocked, the mountaintops and Altxrboy, just are not as fun. In fact, they're honestly worse places to go, containing even harder bosses than the Fire Giant. Which leads me into the potential third reason that pretty much every boss of Elden Ring now revolves around after this point. That of course being this little guy. Spirit Ashes are such a strange addition to Elden Ring, one that I would call unnecessary under normal circumstances, but in this case, the game would have been better off without them. Or I guess not them per se, because 99% of Spirit Ashes are completely worthless, all except for one. The infamous Mimic Tier. It would have already been the best Spirit Ash in the game due to it literally just being a clone of you with slightly less damage, but astronomical health. Though to take matters further, it doesn't cost FP, but instead a set amount of HP, meaning no matter your build, you can just summon a twin practically free of charge with 0 downsides. There is virtually no reason to not use the Mimic Tier. The Fire Giant is where it feels like FromSoft started balancing for the Mimic Tier specifically. AoE attacks suddenly become much more prevalent in every boss here and after, so they can defend against you and your buddy at the same time. These attacks kind of ruin the fun of the boss fight, as it no longer becomes an elegant dance between the two of you, but a sloppy 3-way. Wait, ignore that last part. So why not just not use the Mimic Tier, some of you might be saying? Well, now that the game is balanced around having one, I'm kind of screwed without it. This sloppiness in design can be found in pretty much every late game boss. Godskin Duo might be the worst boss encounter in From's history. Genuinely, this is the point where I consider quitting. You two will never be Ornstein Smaug. Malekith is actually pretty good, but bears the problem of having attack strings longer than a Snyder cut, only giving you the tiniest window of opportunity to dish damage back. This issue gets passed like a hot potato onto Millennia, who comes so close to being excellent if it wasn't for the waterfowl dance. You cannot convince me that there is a legitimate, developer-intended way to dodge this stupid move. It reminds me of the Bed of Chaos from Dark Souls 1, a boss that clearly suffered from a rushed development and never got proper time to be finished. So FromSoft just kinda left it in its janky broken state, with no way to beat it. I'm not saying that's what happened with Millennia, but what I will say is that if my best option to avoid waterfowl dance is to pray that she targets my mimic tier instead of me, something's up. Then of course there's Horaloo, who I've honestly come around recently, but he still was the one who made me hate AoE attacks in the first place, so he doesn't get a pass. Finally, speaking of bosses that were unfinished, Radagon and the Elden Beast should honestly be two different fights, not phases of each other. Because then Radagon would be a good fight. Sure, a little spammy with that AoE, but good nonetheless. He just gets dragged down to hell by the Elden Beast, a boss with attacks that are genuinely undodgeable, or sorry, used to be undodgeable, as FromSoft secretly added the ability for you to summon Torrent during the fight years down the line. Not making it good by any means, but at least somewhat bearable. This is so bizarre to me. Was it always intended to be this way? Why add it 2 years later if so? This is the final boss of the game, for Christ's sake. How could you mess it up this badly? Every time I replay Elden Ring, the last act always manages to leave such a bad taste in my mouth. So much so that I can only really replay this game once a year. Whenever I get the urge to revisit any other FromSoft game, I just boot it up and have fun. But with Elden Ring, I always have to take into consideration pretty much everything I listed above. Is it even worth pouring all of these hours in again if I just end up at my least favorite parts? Look, am I being pretty negative? Yeah, a bit. In all honesty, this criticism's kind of pale in comparison to the fact that I've probably gotten more enjoyment out of Elden Ring than frankly any other Souls game. It's also unrealistic to expect the same fresh feeling of adventure again because that's just impossible. In the end, I still find a ton of new stuff in Elden Ring every time I replay it. FromSoft did a pretty good job at putting a lot of their best items behind stuff like awesome NPC questlines that I wouldn't have even played through or been aware of their existence without the push to find them. Those few fresh experiences mixed in with the good old ones can still make Elden Ring feel like an adventure. I just wish FromSoft had gone the extra mile with replayability and maybe reworking the entire last part of the game, but hey, what can you do? At least the lore aspect of the game will always remain intact. As I mentioned earlier, their integration of us, the player, has only gotten better over time, since it wasn't until a little while ago where our actions taken in Elden Ring made the crucial part of accessing the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. The hype surrounding Shadow of the Erdtree was massive, just as, if not bigger than it was for the base game. Something that I was super surprised by, considering that this is just a DLC for a Soulsborne game, a genre that has always been pretty niche. But it forced me to take a step back and realize that's far from the case anymore. I remember a ton of my friends giving Elden Ring a go when it first came out. Friends who I never even would have thought have heard about Elden Ring in the first place, asking me for build advice or calling me in the middle of boss fights for help. I think that was due to massive content creators and streamers discovering the game, namely Kai Cenat, who averaged over 100,000 viewers in his massive marathon. An event that I suspect will go on to be a defining moment in Souls game history. To date, Elden Ring is one of the best-selling games of all time, with almost 30 million copies to its name, though there was a bit of a problem. As I think a lot of you know, there's a section of Souls veterans who can get very passionate about the series in more ways than one. So you mix all of these new fans into one large hype train and barrel it towards the DLC, you create a Molotov cocktail of controversy. Shadow of the Erdtree is too hard was the phrase of the day every day for a good few months. There was a lot of criticism online towards Shadow's approach to boss design, namely how the bosses had too much health, dealt way too much damage, had attack strings that went on for way too long, and spamming moves like AoE attacks. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? I wonder where that all started. Look, I'm not going to pretend that my take on the late base game is anything special, as a lot of people seem to share my opinions, though when they do give said opinions publicly, they were usually downvoted, disliked, and quote tweeted to oblivion. Namely because of those snarky Souls veterans that I mentioned earlier. But going into the DLC, we have all of those newer, more casual fans who aren't chronically online and don't mind airing their grievances. Now the fans who criticize the base game, like me, finally have an outlet to express their opinions alongside them. Suddenly, the Souls vets no longer have control over online opinion, sparking all-out war. Did things get out of hand to the point where there was no room for actual conversation and people were just ragging on each other for clout? Yes, 1000%. Especially after opinions seem to shift towards one side over the other. Another thing I've realized thanks to the DLC is how a lot of Souls fans play these games. Now, I personally like to utilize every single option the games give you. That means the Mimic tier and summons. In fact, that's how about 60 to 70% of players go about it as well. As I talked about before, sometimes these options hurt the game, but they're there nonetheless, so I use them, and most of the time I have a lot of fun doing so. But a pretty loud minority are the opposite. They like to fight just them, the boss, one-on-one, no other factors at play, and that's fine. Everybody should be able to play how they want and how they find the most enjoyment. After all, that's what Souls games have always been about, player freedom, allowing you to leverage the game's systems however you like. But the end game of base Elden Ring started to very much lean into my style of play, or at least balanced around it due to the presence of the Mimic tier. But it wasn't to the point where that was super noticeable, especially if you were a new fan, duking out solo, but if anybody did notice it, their opinion was often discarded. But Shadow of the Erdtree was a massive tip in the scales, to the point where it could be no longer ignored with the addition of the Shadow Tree Fragments and Revered Spirit Ashes. Items in the DLC that can double the damage output and have the damage taken of both you and your Mimic tier. A lot of people complain that these feel more like a cheap band-aid to balance scaling, and to be fair, they are. But frankly, there is no other way FromSoft could have gone about it. Think for a sec. Let's say an unassuming new player enter the DLC about halfway through the base game. At like level 70, they're still going to have a bit of a challenge, but somehow push through nonetheless. If the fragments didn't exist and FromSoft had to reward the player with souls from beating the boss, that would be a lot of souls to keep them leveled enough to progress. Now this person comes out of the DLC at level 200, absolutely demolishes the base game to the point where the intended experience is ruined. But with the fragments not applying to the base game, the need for massive swaths of souls is gone, and they progress the base game normally with normal stats. This allows the DLC to be its own separate thing, but unfortunately, it also massively hinders it for people who like to fight one-on-one. A good majority of them consider these shadow fragments cheating in a way, as this is technically an item that gives them an advantage over the boss. Does this make sense? Frankly no, as this is just how the game scales, but they're stubborn. Though let's say they do use the fragments, doubling their stats. Well, they're missing out on the Spirit Ashes that boost their Mimic tier, the other 50% of the DLC's scaling. This is where a lot of the vitriol towards Shadow came from, the fact that it was balanced around you using your Mimic tier to the nth degree. You were not going to have a good time if you didn't use it. Miyazaki himself made that extremely clear in interviews. On one hand, I do feel for the side that plays without it, as Souls games should be viable to every playstyle, especially if majority of the base game is. But on the other hand, people always act like FromSoft has betrayed them somehow and sullied their holy video game series. Silly Twitter war aside, how does Shadow of the Erdtree feel when you actually play it the developer intended way? Up until the very end of my first DLC playthrough, I was once again swept off my feet by Elden Ring, just like with the base game. There was just so much to explore. I got lost for hours and hours at every turn. The side content this time around was much more varied. Sure, there is the occasional wiper dungeon, but even those have been cranked up to 10 with new unique variations. The side areas are sweeping this time, with massive vistas like the jagged peak and underground plunges of the Stone Coffin Fissure. But who cares about all that? Because the bosses are the main course, and oh boy, are they delicious. They're so much grander, mightier, more terrifying than they have ever been before. Oh yeah, insanely difficult as well. It was taking me hours to finish them off, but that feeling of accomplishment made it all the more worth it. This was my initial impression of the DLC bosses, as I stated in another video a while back.
I actually think that the DLC is pretty decently balanced, except for a few points, but that's for another time.
Unfortunately, I jumped the gun again, as upon replay, I no longer agree with that statement. While AoE attacks are still a abundant in the DLC, they are much more scaled back in favor of regular long-winded attack strings that are focused on one enemy, meaning that bosses can only fight you one at a time, which massively limits their defense. So FromSoft has once again buffed their health and damage out the wazoo, as when you're hitting them, it feels like you're chipping away at an iceberg. The most optimal route is to just pray that the boss attacks your mimic tier while you spam abilities from a distance, wait for an opening, dive in, and back out. If you do get hit for 80% of your health, no matter. Retreat, heal up, and wait your turn again. Sure, this way is still hard, you will die a lot as bosses will randomly decide to insta-kill you, but after 100 attempts, eventually you're going to get lucky enough. In fact, luck kind of becomes the deciding factor as to whether or not you can out-heal a fight, to the point where the DLC stops feeling like a Souls game and more an MMO in terms of gameplay. I mean, I'm just kind of standing there, firing off attacks, healing through damage, hoping the boss will die before I run out of vitality, as the feeling of an elegant dance has gone out the window. I wouldn't say I necessarily mastered any of the DLC bosses or memorized their attack patterns, because beating them on replay just felt so cheap. In fact, I think I was too overleveled with my New Game Plus character, that I straight up one-shotted some of them, including my favorite, the Dancing Lion, which made me kind of sad because I was really looking forward to that fight. So I tried to limit my character by removing items and not leveling, but then the fights became unbearably hard. It was like the balancing was so shaky that the scale would cascade to either side with the slightest change outside of FromSoft's parameters. It is almost as if Elden Ring has gotten too big for its own good, to the point where it couldn't possibly be evened out. But I kept trying to find that balance, and I think I finally did with Mesmer. I made the decision to still summon the Mimic tier, but instead of letting him take all the punches, I would remain front and center. I memorized Mesmer's attacks, dodged all of his blows, and the Mimic tier only helped me over the finish line. It was still hard, but I ended up loving it, to the point where it felt like I was fighting Artorias again for the first time. This was the real Elden Ring experience. Maybe not what FromSoft had intended, but what I got the most enjoyment out of. Unfortunately, I think this all still goes to show how messy Shadow of the Erdtree is, as I, the player, had to balance the game out for myself. But I carried this method with me until the end, having a blast. Up to when I reached the part of the DLC that I despised even the first time playing through it. In fact, this feeling is shared among everyone, as no matter how much the discourse raged online, everyone could sleep soundly knowing they agreed on one thing: how much the final boss sucks. Base Game Radahn is my favorite fight in Elden Ring. The build-up during Ranni's questline, the preamble of the festival, all of the characters I had met charging in alongside me to get our butts kicked in this larger-than-life arena felt like the true apex of the game that it never lived up to again, unfortunately. So to suddenly see him step out of those gates of divinity, reborn at his peak with Miquella on his back, was exhilarating. Does it make sense lore-wise? But that doesn't matter, since I felt just as hyped as when I first fought him. Then, I actually started fighting him. Radahn's first phase is near perfect. The only gripe I have is that giant meteor air attack, because it has a higher chance of hitting you depending on whether or not you're even on the ground or where he's throwing it from. But that's it. Every single move I have managed to etch into my brain. FromSoft has done such a good job at designing and leveraging his animations to make them perfectly executable once you get them down. I have fought him twice now and enjoy every second of that first phase, to the point where I could do it blindfolded. Then for some reason, FromSoft decided to throw all of their perfect work out the window. The second phase is roughly the same. It's all the same moves, but now he will strike maybe about 7 or 8 more times with massive swaths of AoE attacks. My favorite. Before his nerf, he was literally unbeatable, due to the fact that he would crash my PC by summoning every particle effect FromSoft had in their engine, like a 12-year-old trying to lag out the school computer. But now that that is fixed, I still hate him with a passion. I frankly don't even know what to say about him, because there is nothing I can critique, it's all just bad. I mean, look at this attack. Are there even that many iframes for you to dodge correctly? Well, he's actually a god now, and therefore he should have the strength of a god. I don't care, he is not fun. Whenever I beat him, I feel glad that it is over, that I don't have to fight him anymore. I don't think I will ever be fighting him again unless I force myself to. Shadow of the Erdtree managed to replicate the base game's awful final act. A final act that makes me question whether or not the 20 hours it would take me to even get through the front door is worth the effort, as ultimately I'm just going to find disappointment at the end of the road again. Look, despite what it sounds like, I'll say it again. I love Elden Ring and the Soulsborne series so much. I don't know if this channel would even be here if it wasn't for these games. So of course I'm going to be very passionate about my criticisms of Elden Ring, since if nobody is, these issues are going to bleed into FromSoft's future, which is looking very tumultuous right now. In Joseph Anderson's video on Shadow of the Erdtree, he compared the discourse surrounding the game and FromSoft in general to the cultural shift that happened to Bethesda a decade back, a comparison that I thought was very apt. For those of you who somehow don't know, Bethesda Softworks is the legendary studio who are known for making some of the greatest games of all time, like the Elder Scrolls series with Oblivion and Skyrim, but most importantly, the open-world Fallout games. They were treated much like how FromSoftware are nowadays, as gods among men who can do no wrong. Their game design philosophy was light years ahead of the industry, and any shortcomings they had were either actually intentional because you were just too dumb to comprehend their genius. People were ride or die for Bethesda, as no criticism would reach their ears, and that's how they remained, unable to adapt with the times or learn from their mistakes as the industry eventually caught up, leaving Bethesda in its dust with Fallout 4. At this point, Bethesda games were no longer niche, as they had now amassed a much more casual audience that could not be silenced by fanboys online. So when people started playing Fallout 4 and realized it was rather outdated in almost every aspect, as Bethesda's design philosophy had not changed since the 2000s, all hell broke loose. The war online raged for years, and is still going on to this day, as to whether or not Fallout 4 is a broken relic of the past or a secret masterpiece. If you want my opinion, it's nowhere near the latter. Am I comparing Elden Ring to Fallout 4? Yes, but are they the same? Absolutely not, because FromSoft has actually advanced their design philosophy to make the game feel fresh and new in most ways. But as time would go on, Bethesda would refuse to learn from their mistakes, putting out some atrociously bad games like Fallout 76 and Starfield, games mired in an unwillingness to get with the times. Now Bethesda is considered the laughingstock of the industry, a fall from grace so bad it's hard to remember a world where they were ever on top. Again, am I comparing FromSoft to Bethesda? Yes. Is it one-to-one? Of course not. I can't imagine FromSoft putting out a single bad game in the current age, but maybe in a later one. The sooner we admit that Elden Ring is not perfect, the better. The sooner we can criticize the things that we love in a healthy way, the sooner things will be better the next time. Because I don't think FromSoft really learned their lesson with the late base game, as a lot of those elements carried into the DLC. I'm not saying that the next Soulsborne game will be bad and have only the worst parts of Elden Ring, but FromSoft might start to repeat the mistakes instead of fixing them, snowballing to shove them off their well-deserved pedestal. But if I'm being honest, I think there's already a lot of change in store. Change for the better. Miyazaki has stated that he knows he's not getting any younger, and sadly, will have to hand off the reins to the next generation. I think that Elden Ring is almost his swan song in a way. I don't think that this will be the last Miyazaki Soulsborne game, but I think this will be the last one he gives his all for, as he wants to spend his remaining time bringing up those younger than him as leaders, giving them guidance to realize their vision and create their own fresh, new ideas. We already saw that with FromSoft putting out their first non-Souls game in over a decade, Armored Core 6, and it was fantastic. I cannot wait to see what they do with that series. Plus, just a little bit ago, we got the announcement for Elden Ring Nightreign, a new co-op, online, roguelike, potentially battle royale thing. We don't really know what it is, but this will be the first time FromSoft's ever done a spin-off before, and that's exciting. Whatever comes next, I hope that the Souls community can take it in a healthy way, as if we don't evolve, then the games we love won't either.